Welcome everybody, good evening. My name is Quentin Compton-Bishop, I'm the chairman of the Levantine Heritage Foundation. Welcome to another one of our London talks, and this evening we're very pleased to have two speakers, and if I may read your profiles and hopefully get your names right. So the first speaker is Gwendolyn Collaço, who is finishing her PhD at Harvard University, and her focus is on single folio paintings during the 17th and 18th centuries in Istanbul, but her research also goes into 19th century print cultures across the Islamic world, and she has already secured a job as assistant curator in Los Angeles at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. So she'll be our first speaker, and then I'm going to introduce Richard Wittmann after that. So Gwendolyn, if you'd like to start. Sure. What's yours?
Thank you. And can everyone hear me?
So far, so good.
Okay, wonderful. So I first encountered the album featuring this print when I arrived for my first year of my doctoral program. And upon sharing my research interests with our Islamic art bibliographer at the Fine Arts Library, Andras Riedelmeier, his eyes immediately lit up, and he said the words that every researcher should feel lucky to hear. We just purchased something that you must see. And so he introduced me to the Fulgenzi album, a work that captures a moment of flux for both illustrated works on paper and the wider political atmosphere of the Ottoman Empire during the mid-19th century. It was dubbed by later owners as the Collection de costumes civils et militaires, scènes populaires et vues de l'Asie mineure. And the album is a product of the bustling print scene of the 1830s Smyrna, now Izmir. Within it, 25 hand-colored engravings and lithographs feature cityscapes like the ones you see here, as well as urban figures, bucolic scenes, and political portraits. Each is signed by the designer and printer, the brothers Eugenio and Raffaele Fulgenzi, respectively. And according to the plates, the Fulgenzis printed all folios between the years 1836 and 1838. And during this time, print media of numerous sorts relentlessly documented the social transformations brought by Tanzimat reforms and upheavals in multiple regions of the Ottoman Empire. Stories and images flooded the burgeoning press of the capital and urban centers like Smyrna. Small presses that specialized in pamphlets and single-leaf prints, like the ones here, contributed to that lush print market in a unique way. Whether consciously or not, their images responded to these events, just as their designs contributed to the constant circulations of art and media throughout the Mediterranean. So tonight, I'd like to take you through this work, starting with the diverse designs adapted by the Fulgenzi printers, which tell a story of the transcultural mobility and the wide appeal of these subjects across intersections of visual media, both old and new. Next, I'll situate the subjects within the cultural landscape of Smyrna and its current events in the 1830s. And finally, I'd like to share how this album related to its owner, the prominent American merchant in Smyrna by the name of Thomas Wally Langdon, perhaps also offering us a window into his personal interests and his commercial ties to the Levantine port. And if you want to learn more about this album, you're welcome to take a look at some of the copies we brought with us of the publication we just did through the Max Weber Foundation and the Orient Institute. It's a beautiful facsimile, so I hope you take a look. And to begin with the work itself, I should also mention it's online. To begin with the work itself, the diverse media sources for the many illustrations within this album attest to the circulation of artwork across the wider Mediterranean. And a brief look at the sources for these plates reveals the ways in which the Fulgenzi printers consumed and reinvented materials that were carried on various trade routes that converged in Smyrna. The mid-19th century throughout Europe and the Near East was an experimental era for art and technology, wherein painted portraits could take on an increasingly printed aesthetic, And prints could often incorporate hand-painted elements or even simulate brushwork to varying degrees. And here we have two examples of a print on the right and a painting from a costume album on the left. So therefore, the discussion of one medium can hardly occur without the others and reference to wider issues of image transfer. As a product of the period, this album mediated an intervisual mode, drawing inspiration across the spectrum from painting to printed sources. And to contextualize these techniques, the printer's label, preserved on the inner cover, gives a sense of the products and the consumer profile for the print shop known as Fulgenzi & Sons Engravers. As the title suggests, the Fulgenzi shop specialized in both print and lithography. And in case you're not familiar with these two techniques, intaglio, printing and engraving, uses a dry point to incise designs onto often a copper plate. And for engravings, they often use a tool called a burin, which you see here. And this is combined with many other methods of incising, like stippling with little dots, or etching, which uses acid to cut that design into the metal plate. Lithographs, on the other hand, are a much later invention of the late 1700s. And as you can see, it involves an artist drawing on a limestone tablet with a greasy or waxy crayon. And as you might already tell, it's much easier on the hands, and also it allows the artist to create a more autobiographical stroke that allows the print to look a bit more like a graphite drawing, or in some cases a painting. And after the design is made, the stone is then chemically treated in order to hold that design. And so the Fulgenzis put these two processes to wide use. In the text surrounding our main shop title, we can see that the label discloses further details of the wares that they sold, which included seals and stamps, writing elements related to commerce and administration, and surprisingly also various labels for perfumeries. So from this single album, we can surmise the range of patronage the Fulgenzis cultivated, spanning business class patrons, which included merchant families, as well as popular consumers. As for the illustrations, the mix of subject matter that its designers employed allowed this shop to attract a broad clientele. In one sense, the characters within the album marked a printed reincarnation of a long tradition of loose-leaf painting in the Ottoman Empire, which began during the early modern period. So previously, these types of single-figure paintings were sold in urban bazaars, and were often the products of Muslim artists that were catering their works to both urban Ottomans and foreigners, and most notably those are costume albums. The courtly figures and urban stock characters that dominated these works remained popular even into the era of printing. Designers of engravings and lithographs, like the Fulgenzis, capitalized on the established popularity of these images by transforming them into print renditions. And several of their plates have close analogs among the later costume albums that were made during the end of the 18th century and early 19th century. And here we have a Tatar, which follows a design seen on the right from one of the Dietz albums, now in the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin. And we have another strong instance that appears in the form of a group of porters from Istanbul, as the album states. And this design is also found in a costume album now at the German Archaeological Institute in Istanbul. The adaptations in the Fulgenzi album attest to the appeal and transmission of these designs from urban centers to other cities well beyond the capital. And moreover, prints of the mid-19th century not only drew inspiration from painted forms in design, but also in elements of execution, forging continuities with previous traditions of illustration. In our album, at post-printing, a careful hand applied watercolor to each plate with bright pastel shades. And given the consistency of this palette from this album and other surviving plates done by the Fulgenzis, the same print shop likely applied these colored hues. Therefore, while employing newer technologies of print production, the creator did not neglect older techniques of painting to achieve a final polychrome effect. And the person who did this was possibly Eugenio Fulgenzi. And I say this because he is the attributed painter of an oil on canvas work that's now at the Cyprus Institute. Moreover, it was not unusual for artists to work across media as trained polymaths. Other lithographers of Smyrna followed this dual professional path. For instance, Bajos Tatikian, who was a celebrated Ottoman Armenian printer who started his career as a painter before he turned to creating lithographic works. And the distinctions between mediums of paint and print were far more blurred in the early to mid-19th century. And we can see many parallels in other areas of the Islamic world, such as Qajar, Iran. And so the Fulgenzis equally pulled from other areas as well, such as the world of print. The portraits of regional leaders like Ali Pasha of Yanina and Muhammad Ali of Egypt were likely adapted from older circulating prints, such as this frontispiece to Richard Alfred Davenport's book, The Life of Ali Pasha of Yanina, which was likely used to create a portrait of an entirely different regional leader, Muhammad Ali Pasha of Egypt. It remains unclear if the image's new identity occurred by mistake, since Ali Pasha of Egypt was also Albanian born, or perhaps it was a convenient choice on the part of the designer to choose another image of an Albanian born man. In practice, older prints like this often acted as a guide for engravers to extract facial features down to the placement of the brow ridges, which we can see on both of our figures, the shape of the mustache in some instances, or possibly augmenting them, and other details like the eyes and the distinct gaze. And these were used to mix and match to create a new portrait altogether. Meanwhile, the Fulgenzi plate of Ali Pasha of Yanina draws from a sketch of the same individual by Louis Dupré, taken from life at Bucintro in 1819. And this portrait also went through at least two intermediary stages before appearing in this Fulgenzi album. This work first appears in print as an English etching with aquatint published in 1823, done in London, and it quickly spread in subsequent French lithographs from the artist's own print shop. Therefore, the album gives a sense of the intermediary nature of art and art making during this time, which depended on the active adaptation and alteration of model forms arriving through global trade routes. The fact that the Fulgenzis were able to get their hands on these sources gives a sense of some of the media that made its way to Smyrna and the artistic possibilities that such foreign imports could realize. Aside from artistic transfers, during this period, new technological methods of print spread by means of international networks that converged in regional ports like Smyrna. For example, lithography had only arrived in the Ottoman realms in the year 1831 via French printers, and lithographic printing did not truly gain ground in the capital of Istanbul until the 1850s. Thus, in order to fully appreciate the development of lithographic production in the Ottoman Empire, we actually have to look beyond the capital. And for this purpose, the Fulgenzi album is a significant case study for early Ottoman forays into lithographic printing. In this album, we have the equestrian portrait of Mahmud II and also the portrait of Abdulkadir that both preserved use of lithographic processes paired with a hand-painted watercolor. The early appearance of lithography in this album, again, made primarily during the 1836 to 1838, challenges the center-periphery dynamics of technological trends, and it highlights the role played by the empire's liminal figures in this movement. In particular, the success of lithography and greater print in the market of Smyrna before these trends swept through the capital built upon international exchanges that the port city's environment facilitated. For one reason for Smyrna's prominence in the development of press and print stemmed from the very fact that it was not Istanbul. The regional location offered its own benefits from an increasingly monitored world of print in the capital, We have missionary reports from the 1830s and 40s that tell of the limitations of the freedom of press and printing of various forms in Istanbul. And time after time, these reports related that Smyrna became the premier port through which censored literature could pass as imports. And they noted how its presses enjoyed a greater freedom to determine the subject matters that they addressed, like some of these revolutionary leaders. Home to the empire's first established newspapers in the 1820s, Smyrna sustained a dynamic press presence. The Fulgenzi album and its contemporaries offer a chance to view a market that grew with relatively little intervention from the Central Ottoman government. In fact, the location of the Fulgenzi shop put their operation at the heart of this vibrant print society. According to the printer's plate, the shop was located on Rue Frank, or the Frankish Street, which ran across 1/4 of the entire city. And on this street resided foreign consuls in grand mansions, janissaries, and an array of merchants from Europe that included, but was not limited to, the English, Dutch, Russians, Austrians, Spanish, and Portuguese. Called Le Petit Paris du Levant, this area of Smyrna had a strong foreign identity. Some visiting Ottomans would even dub the city Kafir Smyrna, or Infidel Smyrna. And this largely Christian neighborhood was where one could find the fashionable center of social life in Smyrna, not excelled anywhere else in Europe, so they said. The club cum coffee house, known as the Casino, acted as the hub of it all, where most balls and masquerades took place, supported by subscriptions from the most respectable merchants in the city. Additionally, this establishment acted as a library of periodicals and regularly offered its members a table of newspapers available from numerous different countries. And this may be how some of our sources for these images came into Smyrna. The works of the Fulgenzi brothers fit snugly into this world of international print and social life. A snapshot of the cosmopolitan print market reveals the innovative angle that the Fulgenzi shop brought to these consumers. Protestant missionary groups, again, painstakingly documented press abroad in order to aid in disseminating their publications and also spread the gospel. By 1840, they recorded that Smyrna had three news presses, a type foundry, 4 Greek founts, 4 Armenian ones, 4 Hebrew, 4 English, and about 400 cuts, and a bindery. Therefore, Smyrna abounded with printers at this early stage of both press and lithographic production. Among them, small and relatively humble printers contributed not only to the increasing number of newspapers and books, but also pamphlets, posters, handbills, cards, and tickets, which flavored the visual culture of the 19th century. The relatively low cost of both production and purchase fueled the popularity of these works, and we can see similar trends elsewhere in Europe and as far as the United States. Powered by mechanized presses, lithographic stones and engraved copper plates yielded far greater quantities to sell than their painted counterparts, even when some contained hand-painted elements like the ones you see. Thus, a potential customer encountered an array of single plates to choose from and bind as they saw fit. And while the print practice that emerged was widely transcultural, the subject matter remained decidedly more specific to this Mediterranean arena. And in one sense, this album preserves various members of communities that contributed to Smyrna's vibrant social tapestry. Foreign travelers often remarked on the diversity of the social fabric and frequently bought stock character prints of each ethno-religious group as they passed through the city. And this is how a number of our Fulgenzi prints made their way into collections in England and across continental Europe. One American pilgrim by the name of John Durbin traveled within a few years of the Fulgenzi album compilation. And as he describes Smyrna, he almost mirrors the selection of figural types portrayed in the Fulgenzi work. He writes, quote, "The people of different nations dwell in different quarters. The Franks live on the marina, or the quay, where flags of many nations may be seen flying. The Greeks occupy the center of the city, adjoining the Franks, though as you can see here, they also lived in more rural areas. The Turks dwell on the declivity of the mountain, adjacent to their cemeteries, while the despised Jews burrow near the foot of the hill. And the quarter of the Armenians lies to the north of the city, adjacent to the gardens, which extend to the Caravan Bridge. And so in this regard, the selection of characters here form a part of a wider visual dialogue between artistic technique and local identity building that unfolded during the 1830s. And this transcended mediums. The stock character studies at any given time were likely driven by the demands of the market. In this regard, the Smyrna print market resonated most closely with its contemporaries abroad. As one printer in London during this time astutely noted, quote, "Giving them subjects which are suited to their tastes is the main thing. You may do many fine things, and they will not buy them if you do not give them a subject which they value," end quote. So according to their own clientele, the printers like the Fulgenzies offered enticing prints of local inhabitants, which were a favorite among travelers, as well as scenes and portraits relating to current events, which were a draw both for the locals and foreigners. Single-leaf prints like the ones in this album also contributed to the vibrant journalistic profile of the city. Small pamphlets and leaflets became a way to spread news quickly, and such evocative images had the potential to speak to both a literate and illiterate audience. And while the printers took care to provide captions in the three dominant languages of Smyrna, Greek, Ottoman, and French, the image was the only factor that transcended all of these linguistic boundaries. And particularly in Smyrna, print media and ephemera of this sort would go on to propel social change by uniting various interest groups, and likewise, it offered a space for legitimizing burgeoning civic discourses. And a closer look at some specific political portraits chosen for this album by its American compiler demonstrates just how closely these loose-leaf portraits resonated with concerns of the contemporary press. So while costume albums in the capital trended towards memorializing historical costumes of the previous centuries, outside of the capital, illustrators like the Fulgenzies focused far more on the tumultuous present. And the owner's signature appears at the top of this page down, revealing his identity as Thomas Wally Langdon, whose family belonged to the earliest, whose family was among the earliest American merchants to establish a trade post in Smyrna. The family arrived in Smyrna, drawn by the allure of a new frontier, offering a fresh market to import Indian cotton, Turkish carpets, dyes, and spices, among other exotic goods. And they also strove to export American goods like indigo, sugar, fur, and coffee. Thomas Wally Langdon traveled frequently between the family's trade posts in New York and Boston, as well as taking long voyages to the family business in Smyrna. Before his death in 1854, he eventually married late in life and settled in New York. And given the 1830s dates on these plates, it's very likely that this album was made shortly before he retired from the trade. Perhaps a souvenir for his new wife or a gift from relatives still manning the trade circuit in Smyrna, this album allowed Thomas Wally Langdon to maintain a connection to his former home abroad. And at the same time, his collection contributed to wider genres of exchange media and album making, which had grown in popularity amongst middle-class consumers in the United States and elsewhere since the 1820s. Curated to the interests of Langdon, this album functions as a quasi-autobiographical work, revealing influence in his life and his concerns as an individual to a certain degree. And many of the stock character portraits reflect the individuals he likely encountered on a regular basis in the social landscape of Smyrna, while others likely had a far more personal connection. For example, the scene of the slave merchant and his captives on the shores of Constantinople had particular significance for the Langdon family in recent years. In 1827, Langdon's nephew, Joseph Langdon, had rescued a Greek slave girl by the name of Gariphilia Mohalabi, who, at only 9 years old, found herself the property of a Muslim household after her family was killed at the hands of Ottoman soldiers. As soon as Joseph Langdon met her in the Smyrna bazaar, he was moved to buy and emancipate her before eventually bringing her back to Boston with him. Although dearly loved by the Langdon family, she died at the early age of 13, shortly after she was sent to an Ursuline convent for schooling. And this girl's tragedy went on to inspire a number of written and artistic works, a couple of which you see here. And these types of works went on to fuel the American abolitionist movement leading up to the Civil War. Now, the Fulgenzi plate captures the plight experienced by Garoffilia, with its doleful slave girls bearing downcast eyes, and its inclusion not only allows a family to memorialize a recently departed loved one, it also gives the viewers a sense of the family's stance on a brewing debate on slavery that escalated tensions in both the United States and the Ottoman Empire. So in a broader context, the album reflects Langdon's keen interest in political issues that extended far beyond the United States, touching on major foreign affairs that dominated the journalistic press of the day. His album offers portraits of figures from current events, with particular attention paid towards political upstarts in the Mediterranean. Not only were these major news stories of the time, such uprisings had further appeal to an American trader. Now, we must remember, at this point, the United States was still a relatively young nation, and its revolutionary past still played a formative role for its citizens. And the new commercialism that brought the Langdon family to the shores of Smyrna arguably grew out of a patriotic fervor amongst American merchants to establish commerce relations independently of the British. On the other hand, the shared cause for independence may have prompted some Americans to feel a certain affinity with patriots abroad, or at the very least, take notice of their struggles in foreign affairs. And this was particularly the case for Greece, whose appeal also was bolstered in part by Philhellenism. And this caused a significant number of Americans to throw monetary and political support to revolutionaries who were seeking liberty abroad. And some of these revolutionary hopefuls and recent victors came from within the Ottoman realms and their former territories. This included King Otto of the newly formed Kingdom of Greece, in addition to Ali Pasha of Vienna and Muhammad Ali of Egypt, whom we saw earlier. The movements led by local leaders I named disturbed the imperial order of the Mediterranean world and likely piqued the personal commercial interests of the Langdons. With regional powers asserting control over trade routes, merchants like the Langdons had to keep abreast of developments that would have impacted the passage of their cargo across the Mediterranean. And these rebels also gained popular acclaim abroad. For example, in 1838, when the Fulgenzi brothers printed their lithograph of Sheikh Abdul Qadir, the Sheikh was still actively resisting French conquest in Algeria. Numerous articles from American newspapers around this time praised his struggles and admired him as a freedom fighter. Moreover, images like these went on to have a role in furthering international discourse about these events. In fact, both this image of Abdul Qadir and that of young King Otto of Greece enjoyed an afterlife as illustrations in print serials over the next decade. And here we have another one of those, and another adaptation of the King Otto portrait. Again, entering the circulation of mobile media, the recycling and readaptation of Fulgenzi plates, or portraits they inspired, color our contemporary perspective of the immediacy of the press. These stories, or the story of these images, illuminates the journalistic process wherein each issue also acted as a compilation, wherein a layout designer would bring together older prints alongside fresh texts to fashion a popular reaction to political events. And finally, the Fulgenzi album captured a major social transformation unfolding in the Ottoman Empire that caught the attention not only of local merchants, but other international news outlets. Most notably, it documents the military and sartorial reforms undertaken by Mahmud II during the 1820s and 30s. In fact, the portrait of Sultan Mahmud on plate 14 showcases his newest attire, complete with a crimson wool fez and European-style uniform. Behind him in the distance, we can see his newly updated army on the left, and his palace on the right, joined by the city spanning behind his towering figure. The stark transition over the last years of Mahmud II's reign is further punctuated by a dual portrait on plate 11 of two khawas who worked as guards and messengers to diplomats. Placed in direct conversation with one another, the two figures stretch the compositional conventions of the costume album genre, which normally only had one figure per page, to make a poignant narrative statement on a historical development. The two guards in new and old uniforms visually enact the changing of the guard's costume on the page. The seated figure in the older garb raises an indicative pointed hand, giving way to the looming gray uniform of his successor, who looks down upon him in his outdated costume. Soldiers in these new uniforms could often be found in the newly created city barracks, which is actually the U-shaped structure highlighted there on the lower right. And it was established in 1829 as the permanent residence of the Nizam-e Jadid, or the new order of troops sent to Smyrna. So to conclude, the Harvard Fulgenzi album embodies cross-currents of media, both in the artistic and journalistic sense. It demonstrates how these modes of representation fed into one another to create a commentary on significant social changes within the Mediterranean. From a small family print shop on the Frankish street of Smyrna, the plates of this album also tell a story of commercial dynamism on a local and international level, as it intersected in this port city. The album gives us a sense of the individuals who contributed to this vibrant Mediterranean landscape, whether named or anonymous, and the plates bearing their images preserve a remembered population and traces of their designers' skilled hands. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you very much. So we'll take questions at the end to make sure we get through both speakers and give them the fair time. So hold those questions for later. So our second speaker this evening is Dr. Richard Wittmann from the Orient Institute, Istanbul. So his background is from Munich, where he studied law, Islamic studies, and now he resides in Istanbul at the Orient Institute. And he's going to talk to us about the Feriköy Protestant Cemetery. Richard, over to you.
Let's just see where we have this file.
Yes, if it does get quite noisy later, do come forward. And if you can't hear, put your hand up and we'll encourage Richard to speak more loudly.
If that doesn't help, I use it. Dear members of the Levantine Heritage Foundations, dear ladies and gentlemen, it is a particular honor to be able to speak before you tonight and to introduce you to an often overlooked aspect of the Levantine presence in Turkey. We all enjoy learning about the colorful lives and the manifold contributions made by Levantines in the realms of trade, commerce, education, diplomacy, and the arts. Just a few minutes ago, we heard about the marvelous album from 1830s Izmir. An album that was both commissioned and produced by Levantines of different nationalities, Italian and American respectively. Let's give credit and recognition to the living, but let's not forget about the deceased and their commemoration either. In the minutes to come, you will hear about a remarkable cemetery situated today in the midst of the Turkish metropolis of Istanbul, which serves as the last place of rest for a great number of Levantines who used to live in the former Ottoman capital and its surroundings. The Feriköy Protestant Cemetery has been and continues to be the foremost burial ground for nationals of many Protestant nations in Turkey. With its landscaping and extraordinary architectural features, it is a fascinating yet hardly known landmark of the city and an example of Protestant Levantine funerary forms, the preservation and documentation of which is one of the central aims of the Ferryköy Protestant Cemetery Initiative. Prior to the establishment of a community cemetery at Ferryköy in 1859, Protestant dead in Istanbul were usually buried in the Frankish, the European section of the Grand Champ de Mort, or the Great Field of the Dead, as one of the city's largest cemeteries located in Pera, today's Beyoğlu. Beginning in the mid-19th century, here we see a depiction of the Champ de Mort, a rare depiction from the mid-19th century. And beginning at that time, the area north of Taksim witnessed a rapid urban growth, and the Frankish graveyard lay directly in the path of expansion. Land for a new funeral ground at Ferryköy was presented in 1857 as a gift of Sultan Abdülhamid I, who reigned from 1839 to 61, to the embassies of the leading Protestant powers of the time: Great Britain, Prussia, the United States of America, the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and the Hanseatic cities. The area chosen for the Protestant cemetery in the map, where you see the word Şişli above Istanbul and Beyoğlu, encompasses over 1 hectare of land in the district of Ferryköy, the cost of which, estimated at more than 200,000 piasters, was paid by the Ottoman treasury. Even though the first person was buried at the new location in November 1858, the burial ground did not officially open until a few months later in 1859. Distant from the city's settled areas, this site was ideal for a cemetery. Since the burial ground's opening in 1859, approximately 5,000 individuals of all nationalities and backgrounds have been interred here. Almost detached in time and space from the modern metropolis outside its walls, the cemetery stands as a monument to Istanbul's communal richness and diversity, and a proud Levantine past in the city. While by far the greatest part of all graves are those of foreign nationals, there is also a small area of Armenian Protestant graves. Here you see one such example. Management of the Ferryköy Protestant cemetery is entrusted to a governing body comprised of the Consuls General of Germany, the United Kingdom, the USA, the Netherlands, Sweden, Hungary, and Switzerland. Here we see an official map of the cemetery produced for the governing board around 1900. All documents pertaining to the operation of the cemetery are kept by the diplomatic members of the governing board since the inauguration of the cemetery in 1859. Today, they are being meticulously kept in these blue binders. Here, the Consul of the Netherlands, Mr. Ton, has kindly taken them out for us. To my left stands Brian Johnson, no relation to political leaders in this part of the world. He works at the American Research Center in Turkey, and we are surrounded by interns at our research centers we wanted to show them the original documents, which at the moment are kept by the Dutch consul. The presidency of the governing board shifts routinely from one consulate to the next every 6 months. Over the past 20 years in particular, different consulates have during their turn initiated or approved various endeavors at preserving and documenting the cemetery. From 1997 to 2005, with a generous bequest from a former Istanbul resident, Emmett Ermine, the American Board of Missionaries undertook various projects at the cemetery, including renovation of the chapel, construction of a visitor's lodge, production of a historical display, publication of a promotional flyer, and preservation of tombs. The board also collected data to create a permanent memorial record of all those buried at Ferryköy. Its efforts were part of a long tradition of involvement at the site, the beginning with the cemetery's establishment in the late 1850s. Moreover, as a major US institution in Turkey for almost 2 centuries, the board had interred at Ferryköy many of its members and their families who died in service. As the inheritor of the board's historical legacy, arid the American Research Institute in Turkey, also seeks to continue its efforts at the cemetery. Since 2015, it has made an annual guided visit of its local, part of its local tour program. Private donations by American families and individuals are an important factor, and in the spring of this year, a fountain was donated in the memory of an American writer, academic and professor at Bosphorus University, John Freely. Many of you may know his best-selling guidebook on Istanbul, Strolling Through Istanbul. With the help of drones, the Netherlands Institute in Turkey, NIT, has been creating a digital map to plot each grave at Ferryquay. Since some of the graves are hidden by vegetation, they can only be made visible through pictures from above. Here you see one such aerial view from above. And some 75% of the cemetery's extent, 1,000 graves, have already been plotted. The map can later be enriched by overlaying older plans of the site, and more significantly, by integrating it with textual and visual materials from other sources. This important digital tool is not only vital for historical research and documentation, but also for monitoring or conserving the cemetery. In 2012, to enhance access to the funerary records of those buried at Ferryquay, both for their descendants and for academic researchers, the cemetery's governing board asked for help from the German Archaeological Institute and the Orient Institute in Istanbul. The Archaeological Institute contributed its digitization equipment and staff and produced digital images of the cemetery's 2 official burial logs, dated 1858 to 93 and 1894 to 1991 respectively. Digitization was completed in 2012, and from 2013 to 2016, myself as the Orient Institute Istanbul's Associate Director and a team of young scholars used these images to put the logbook entries in French, English and German into an Excel database. Here's a facsimile of a page from the funerary records book. This is from the early years when the handwriting was still very nice. You will later see a copy from closer to our days, and then it looks quite different. The Excel database made the information contained in the 2 handwritten and leather-bound official funerary records searchable for the first time, and thus a resource for research. Until then, finding an entry was practically impossible if one didn't have a complete set of adequate personal data about the deceased. Not knowing the burial date made any search futile, since there was no index. So with the completion of the Excel file, not only did it become possible to find people just by their correctly written name, but it's still quite a hurdle because of typos, inconsistent and wrong spellings in the inventory books, but all sorts of statistical information could also be gained. Here you have a look at this classic Excel sheet, and with the help of this sheet you still see some red spots of illegible names because of the handwriting. It was possible, because of these data sheets, to come up with some quantitative results. For instance, here we have a distribution of funerals according to the states using today's license plates abbreviations. So you see Great Britain forms the biggest component, followed by Germany, each a little more than 30%. But we don't, here you see the 5 top countries: Great Britain, Germany, Switzerland, Turkey. These are Ottoman Turkish citizens, Protestants who were interred there, and the United States. But we also have nationals from 3rd countries, including many non-Protestants from places like China, Japan, Korea, and Protestants who held the passports of other countries, mostly Catholic countries. Here you see another distribution. The darker the color, the more burials from nationals of these countries you have at Ferryquay. Here's a breakdown of the funerals per year. We see a strong peak in 1871. This was a big cholera epidemic that killed tens of thousands of people in Istanbul. And then, predictably enough, another peak during World War I. Here you have a breakdown of the funerals per year for the UK only. Again, the 1871 peak is striking. We have a child death, breakdown of the child death. Here we have a certain delay of the child death related to cholera, because they were better protected by their families or were given in foster care. So the peak there is in 1873. And the relation of child death to overall funerals in Ferryquay. But these are just some examples, but all sorts of quantitative studies on the Protestant cemetery became possible for the first time. What was painfully missing, was to make these Excel-based database usable for everybody. We needed a user-friendly interface that would even please an Apple user. And while searching for funds to pay for the preparation of a searchable database with a user-friendly interface, in 2018 I contacted my colleagues at the American and Dutch Institute in Istanbul to ask for advice as to possible sponsors. What I heard back was much more useful for the genesis of a joint international project. All three of us learned for the first time about the various activities we each had engaged in for quite some time with regard to the Protestant cemetery. Our great surprise was followed by resolve and the wish to join forces to more effectively promote the study and preservation of this landmark. It was the birth hour of the Ferryquay Protestant Cemetery Initiative. Here you see a short description. The Ferryquay Protestant Cemetery Initiative aims to preserve and study Istanbul's main Protestant cemetery as an important local historical landmark. It was founded in 2018 by Brian Johnson of the American Research Institute in Turkey, Fokke Gerrits of the Netherlands Institute in Turkey, by myself for the German Orient Institute Istanbul. And we were joined in 2019 by Gabor Fodor of the Hungarian Cultural Center in Turkey and by Olof Halo of the Swedish Research Institute in Istanbul. These 5 Istanbul-based research centers share the common goal of conserving, recording and researching the site. And we want to document the key role that Protestants played in Ottoman and Turkish societies as academic teachers, artists, merchants, artisans, administrators, and in the armed forces. The Ferryquay Protestant Cemetery Initiative seeks to include other institutions and individuals interested in the cemetery both as an active burial ground and as a landmark. Here you see a photo of my 5 colleagues, the other founding fathers of the initiative. Any idea what they're doing here? They're not playing the davul, the Middle Eastern drum. No, in fact, we're trying to read the inscription of an English gravestone on the cemetery. The initiative is an ongoing project. But what has the initiative done or is currently involved in? We try to inform the public in Turkey and internationally about the works of the initiative. We write about it in newsletters and reports, and we present about this project here in London and also together with my colleague Brian Johnson in 2 weeks' time in Ghent in Belgium at the conference of the Association of Significant Cemeteries in Europe, which meets every year in different places in Europe. We try to raise the awareness of the significance of the cemetery with various stakeholders. Here we organized a guided tour for the consul generals in Istanbul, who formerly lead the governing board of the cemetery. We've also led tours for German, American, and Dutch politicians over the past 3 months. And we're preparing a brochure of the most famous dead of the different nationalities who are interred in Ferryköy. And we hope that this brochure will be ready and available in about 2 months from now. As already mentioned, the Netherlands Institute got permission from the governor of Istanbul to use drones, which produced high-resolution photos of the cemetery. And now, as part of this joint effort of the Ferryköy initiative, we have decided to use these photos to develop a kind of grid, and so we can define areas of the cemetery irrespective of the fact if there's still a gravestone today or not. And also over time many of these graves have been reused, so there are actually several funerary entries to the same plot. We have generated a template for data registration of the graves. We want to note the inscriptions on the individual gravestones and also the physical features of the various graves that are present on the cemetery. As you can imagine, since this is an internationally run cemetery, also the cemeteries in a way reflect the styles of the home countries of the people who are buried there. Here you see a development, a genesis of different forms. The right one is the most developed one, which also forms the basis of a database that I will talk about in a second. Over the summer months, several volunteers and students were equipped with these forms, and at some point we had 20 students from 5 different countries walking around the cemetery and documenting the grave inscriptions to be included in a big database. We've also begun to cross-check the funerary records with other sources, such as death and funeral certificate issued by the participating consulates. Here again we are at the Dutch consulate in Istanbul. But this also was reason for us at the Oren Institute to widen our database project, and we appealed to the German Foreign Ministry for help, and luckily got funding to do exactly that. So now we have a fully searchable database being developed. Here you see a search for a gentleman by the name of Wade. This is just a demonstration of what can be done with such a database. And this database is designed by including a very complicated algorithm that allows searches even with many spelling mistakes and wrong information, and you still find the person you're looking for. In the database we have photos included of the cemeteries. We use the Dutch grid to now locate the various graves on a map. And here you see an overview of the different sections. Section C and D and also E are the British section of the cemetery. The oldest part of the grave is in the C section. But this database also, here you see already the poorly written documents of the official funerary records from the 1980s. This is the official documents preserved by the consuls generals. But you can also include all sorts of other materials, and here you see some examples. The measurements of the physical measurements of the gravestones, but also other photos, literature about some prominent individuals, geodata, and even oddities like novels that were written about various individuals on the cemetery. As this film continues, we will see other functions of this complex database. In a second, jumps above. We now can print the information. You can generate Excel sheets for families or individuals, and it can also be used as an entry mask to complete this database. This is a work in progress. It's by far from finished, but with this database, we now hope to send out volunteers who will be equipped with little tablet computers who can type in the information right inside, and it will directly go into the database to make this all more efficient. Here are again the 5 main bits and pieces of information we would like to include in the database. You have the inscriptions on the gravestones, top left corner, they're being documented. You have the official information from the funerary records prepared by the governing board, a photo of each grave, the exact location on the cemetery, and an aerial image generated by drones. Here are some of the more odd things, novels that have been written about the cemetery. Also, this can be included, Rendezvous at the cemetery of Ferryquay. So people who come up in novels like this, they will also find a book connected to them. Our project aims at length the foundations for future research on the Protestants of Turkey. So the research still needs to be done. But let me conclude with a few preliminary notes on Ferryquay's English connections. These remarks are based on the research by my colleague Brian Johnson, who is preparing the cemetery brochure for us. Along the Ferryquay Protestant Cemetery's east wall, the C section, the map if you remember, which flanks the English section, are many gravestones from the old Frankish burial ground of Taksim, the Grand Champ de Mort, including a number that belong to Englishmen. One of the oldest is the tomb of Richard Hampton, a merchant of Pera who died in 1689. The monument is unique in terms of its form, technically a hipped tomb, with what looks like a 4-sided pointed or hipped roof, a common European tomb type in this period. The monument exemplifies why Ferryquay deserves recognition both as a museum of funerary art and as a tangible link to the earlier Taksim cemetery, which served as a burial place for Europeans dating back to the late 16th century. Though Hampton undoubtedly belonged to Constantinople's local English community for some length of time, many of those who were buried at Taksim or Ferryquay had little or no connection to the city where they now rest. Sailors, for instance, who died at sea and were buried at the cemetery when their ships put into port, or travelers such as George Pulteney Malcolm, whose brief stay in Constantinople ended in tragedy. A young British officer and the son of the famous English Admiral, Admiral Sir Pulteney Malcolm, who lived from 1768 to 1838, George was on his way home to England from India in 1837 when he was caught in an epidemic of plague that swept through the Ottoman Empire that year. He arrived in Istanbul from Trabzon already ill and was dead 4 days later. Reverend William Goodall of the American Board read the burial service at his grave. Malcolm had died in quarters adjacent to his own, and Goodall recounted the incident. Quote, "The unfortunate gentleman," he wrote, "occupied a room which corners our own bedchamber. We placed chlorine in all the rooms that were particularly exposed. But we are certainly in death often, and are made to feel that, except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh but in vain." End of quote. Goodall had reason to be fatalistic. Apparently, when the plague reached its most virulent stage, Istanbul's inhabitants perished at a rate of 6,000 to 10,000 per week. Admiral Sir Pulteney Malcolm was involved in British naval operations during the War of 1812 against the United States. It is slightly ironic that an American missionary presided over his son's burial a couple of decades later. Malcolm made a name for himself by serving as commander of the squadron guarding St. Helena when Napoleon was imprisoned there in 1816, 1817. Otherwise, for two more recent members of the local English community buried at Ferrica, one might consider Lutfie Luli Duran, who died in 2003, and her mother Corinne, who died in 1995. Lulu's father was Faik Sabri Duran, a well-known Turkish author and geographer, and her story and that of her mother offer a glimpse into, as well as a representative sample of, not only the British but the Istanbul expat community as a whole in the 20th century. There's much more to be said about this, but that is for another lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, the Protestant Ferrica Protestant the Cemetery Initiative is an ongoing research and documentation project. Its success rests on the commitment of the members of the initiative and the support of sponsors and volunteers. But we believe our efforts will provide an important service for arriving at a better understanding of the role of Protestant Levantines in Ottoman and Turkish society. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Richard. If you'd like to stay there, Gwendolyn, if you'd like to come up, we've now got time for questions. So, does anyone have a question they'd like to leave with? Yes, please.
It's a question for Gwendolyn. Do any of the illustrations of the Fulgenzi appear in the West? You talked about how the illustrations were spread across the world to the taste of the Europeans and the travellers and so on. Did they actually get reproduced in the illustrated magazines of the period, like the Sphere and the Illustrated London News and the French equivalents? Or have you not yet had time to sort of get to that phase of the dispersal of these illustrations?
It's a good question. I mean, I have started this process, and I think you saw a couple of instances where we have an adaptation appearing in an Italian work, but I haven't quite looked at the English newspapers and journals yet, but that would be an excellent next step. I have no doubt that they did, since the amount of copying and readapting that we see has unbelievable strands that can be traced. I mean, I can think of examples that have traveled from, for instance, the London Illustrated News that ended up in Qajar, Iran. And so I wouldn't be surprised yet, but thank you for, push in the next direction for this project.
Who were the Fulgenzis?
So not much is known about them, and that's part of the problem. They appear in one book that discusses Italian Orientalists. It's likely perhaps they immigrated over from Italy, but we don't have any official information. We have
any family left today or not?
Not to my knowledge. And aside from this attributed oil on canvas painting that I mentioned, that features an archbishop in Cyprus, so perhaps they were on Cyprus before this, but we don't know if they were permanent residents or merely passing through. And that's one of the difficult things about tracking artists, and I can say this from the perspective of someone who tracks them down in Istanbul, and you might be able to find names of artists, but they may not necessarily be the ones that are signing the works that you're looking at. That's part of the challenge of the archive, I suppose. But aside from these mentions in works on Italian Orientalism, I haven't seen too many works mentioning Fulgenzis, other than other plates that appear with their name.
Do we know when the shop was closed?
No, we don't. And we know that it must have been opened sometime before this, because at least from the label it says Fulgenzi and Sons. So
Yes.
presumably the father had set up the shop originally, let us guess at least 10 years prior. And then these sons likely took over this work. And I do believe that they're brothers. They're usually referred to as brothers in subsequent publications that are not contemporary to this album. But again, a lot of these sources that try and reference the Fulgenzis are going back to the same old vendors' catalogs that circulated, selling these works, oftentimes during the late 19th century onwards. So the reliability of it is definitely in question.
Is there a Roman Catholic cemetery in Smyrna where they might be buried?
Ooh, that's a good question. This is the next project for Richard.
It may be that Marianne Marondet's database, because I think she and Jacques Caporal have gone around studying all the Catholic cemeteries. So if you ask Marianne Marondet, we can introduce you.
That would be excellent.
She might be able to help you. Great question. Chris.
Thank you. My understanding is that customers went in and either purchased albums ready-made up, or they made their own selections,
yes,
which would be put into an album specifically for them, so that other albums that you might encounter, that which has just been revealed at another university, so I forget.
It's totally fine.
Brown, David Brown. So that's Ivy League too, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Might be of the same period. It might share some of the prints, but not all of them. Would that be right?
That is exactly the case with this one at Brown. So the image that I showed of the Bridge of Caravans does not appear in the Fulgenzi album at Harvard. And Brown has 5 images that do not appear in the Harvard version. And what I think what happened was that series were likely created, as you said, that could have been bought that way as a full ready-made work. But I think that, especially given how things are sold, which is not always consistently across the series, you likely had works that are sitting there perhaps months, possibly years on end, and then they could be then mixed in with newer works, hence the reason why we have this range of years on our plates that are 1836 to 1838. So you're totally right about how these are created, and we see this picked up later on by photographic series and postcards. So I think malleability of the compilation is something very important to consumers, and I think even before print comes around, because as my own dissertation explores, consumers seem to be interested in creating very idiosyncratic collections that reflect their own experiences or interests, and that's why these albums are so interesting. Yes, they're mass-produced, but even within a mass-produced type of medium, you have a degree of creativity that can go into it. And I think the fact that we can connect this album to so many aspects of Langdon's life makes for a very interesting case study.
Do we know of other albums?
Other albums? Fulgenzi? Yes. Well, let's see. So they pop up at auction, and over the past 20 or so years, I think I've seen, in the records I've been able to see, I've encountered 3 others. The problem is they all have the same title, the very long French title that I said at the beginning, and what's funny is none of these albums have that title in it. It's a title that appears to be applied to it after it's made by, again, these vendors that are trying to sell them later on. And so this makes it very difficult, since you don't know if you're looking in these old catalogs at the same album or a different one. And I mean, it's a pesky situation, but we do have many other single folios. So Victoria and Albert Museum has a wonderful collection, one of which also features that the image of the slave girls and the merchant on the shores of Constantinople, except on the back of that one they also include abolitionist poetry. So you see different ways that people are personalizing these prints as they're buying them and really making it relevant to their own situation.
Thinking about the Protestant cemetery in Istanbul, and whether there were similar, smaller equivalents elsewhere in Turkey that survive to this day.
Yes, there are a number of cemeteries around Turkey. I mean, you're certainly familiar with the British cemetery on the other side, on the Asian side, which is well preserved. But unfortunately, many of these cemeteries, they suffer from the fact that there are no family members in the country anymore. So there's always a problem with the upkeep of these cemeteries. In theory, things should be a lot easier with the Ferryker Protestant cemetery because it's operated by these consuls generals. In practice, it's still not so easy to coordinate such an effort, and also to, given the often short stay of the diplomats, to get them fully involved in the activities. So that's also one of our concerns, where we want to support the consuls in their mission as research institutions which are based longer in the country and can also draw on the resources of our institutions, but also give some of the ideas and make suggestions of what would be needed to be done to preserve the cemetery properly in a very physical way, but also to make it known as such, and to provide access to the information of the individuals there.
Just for information, in Damascus also we have two cemeteries, one for the French and one for the English.
Where is that? In
Damascus. In Damascus.
Syria, yes.
And both of them having the people who died in the First World War and the Second.
Yes, no, thank you very much. Throughout the Middle East, there are many cemeteries. There in Beirut, there's a very well-preserved Protestant cemetery, for instance. In Jerusalem, there is, of course, but they all function in different ways. For instance, they're right next to the Protestant cemetery in Istanbul. There's the big Catholic cemetery, and this is still connected to the church communities in Istanbul. It's operated by the communities, and that works in many ways better than to have the responsibility shouldered to foreign governments. But we try to remedy this by creating an awareness, and by also getting volunteers and members of the local expat communities involved.
I have a further question for you. Did you say 5,000 people are buried there?
Yes.
So it's quite large, and there are many smaller cemeteries scattered throughout Istanbul on both sides, of course. But they're much larger ones, the Greek ones, the Armenian ones, the Jewish cemeteries. And it would be great if your project could be used as a sort of prototype for the mapping of those cemeteries, none of which have been mapped, and are much larger. But of course, as you said, the involvement of the diplomatic authorities makes it a lot easier, and especially America and Great Britain, the main English-speaking, and Germany. The other communities don't have that influence. So it's a great prototype that can be shown as an example, I think.
Even though
safeguarding.
Thank you very much. Even though, having said that, the Greeks are actually one step ahead of us, because they have managed to get their main cemetery in Istanbul accredited as a significant cemetery among the cemeteries in Europe. And we hope to get there soon with the Protestant cemetery. But presenting this cemetery at their annual conference this time in Belgium is the first step towards that.
And there are magnificent cemeteries in Alexandria, Jewish, Greek, and English, and Catholic.
I think that one or two of them are also already in the list of cemeteries that should be protected. So European also goes beyond Europe if Europeans are buried on the cemetery.
Hello? Excuse me. Can I just offer
I'm named
some
Chris.
information? I'm connected with an organisation, one of the many hats I am, that has a database of worldwide names of individuals from different countries. It's their business to catalogue names across the world, and they cross-reference individuals' names both historically and to the present. And I wonder whether that would be something that you'd like to know about.
Yes, I'd certainly like to know more about this. Is this a publicly available source, or is...
Yes, yes. I mean, it's a private organisation, but I'm sure it will be of interest to you to talk to the founders and see, because, as I say, they sit on millions of names, and the originator, which is from this country, actually was the originator of the postcode database here. So it's kind of something that they do as another add-on, but I think this would be very useful for your research.
Thank you very much. Yes,
Christopher.
As a preamble, I've been connected for 30 years with a British charity, very small British charity, which for 45 years has concerned itself with the recording and the conservation of Christian cemeteries in South Asia, principally in India, but also in the other territories which were at one time or another associated with the British Raj or the East India Company. But so I'd love to talk to you in a more general sense about that, but my specific question regarding your presentation, your aerial shot showing the cemetery, to the right there was a similar-sized plot marked Cimetière Latin.
Yes, this is the Catholic burial ground, which is
immediately adjacent, and
under the nuncios of the Vatican. It's operated by the Catholic churches of Turkey.
And was laid out at the same time.
Yes, it was also. It also started with graves being moved from the Taksim area, from the old cemetery, to this new area. There's also a much bigger Muslim cemetery, not far from the Christian cemeteries. So this was developed as a cemetery area in a way, just like the Jewish cemeteries were developed around the Golden Horn, Balat, in Mosul and Haskell.
I actually wanted to ask a question as well. Just because I'm curious, aside from presenting, how does one become a significant cemetery of Europe?
Well, I'm trying to find out the details in 2 weeks' time in Belgium. But I understand this is a very time-honored and professional association which has developed a catalogue of criteria over the past decades. And it's not so easy to join this club. Because you have to fulfill a lot of criteria before, and only then can you benefit from their services and their inspirations and suggestions.
So you start 300 years ago.
Yeah.
Work forward.
No, and it's all the famous cemeteries around the world that have the status.
I mean, a question really to both. I mean, how can we as the Levantine Heritage Foundation help? Now, clearly, connection to someone like Admiral and who've got photographs of all the tombstones in the Catholic cemeteries in the database. But each of you, how else can we help you?
You should go first.
Well, quite very grateful for this question, because we actually need help of the British community in order to find out who all the people buried on the cemetery were. With the exception of a few, illustrious, famous people buried on the cemetery, it's extremely difficult to collect this information. And it would be wonderful to have members of the expat British community in Istanbul involved in this. At the moment we've started something similar doing with this German and the American community there. We've just started with interviewing people in the 80s and 90s who can point out so many of these graves and also know connections which are not so obvious. Cousins buried 2 graves away who don't have the same last name, for instance. And this all is crucial information to develop a kind of catalogue. In one of the slides you saw that the Americans have done that for their part of the cemetery. It's also, I think, not complete, kind of handbook of who's buried in the various sections, and we need to do that for the whole cemetery. And this cannot be done except for the help of volunteers, and we need a lot of engagement and people in the know about the graveyard.
Presumably the archives of the consulates here in England have all of the deaths in Istanbul in them, because the consulates have to report the deaths, they have to register them.
Yes.
Are those archives not also available in Istanbul, or do you have to kind of go down to Kew to read them?
Well, with the help of this database, we may get one step further, but until now, we didn't have an index. So you'd have to know when people were buried, at what time. And it was always not the individual countries, but the community of the countries, keeping the register. So to arrive at these very practical bits and pieces of information, not that easy actually. And even then, very often you would just have the minimum information, the names of the people buried there. Sometimes the fees that were not paid or that are still owed to the cemetery. But not much more. Also, these official registers, up until now, they are kept by different countries for 6 months at a time. And different degrees of meticulousness were applied. So while in some years we have the death reason mentioned, we have other family members mentioned already buried on the cemetery. Very often we only have the names, nothing else.
And in the English press, did that death section?
Yes. But again, did they specify the denomination? Or did they just name somebody as an Englishman or Englishman? It's not that easy. It's tricky, and it really needs a lot of people to help with this. What we try to do as the initiative is more or less start with the database. This can be the foundation, and then we have something to feed with further information. In addition to that, we can give counsel and make some suggestions.
When do you envision it going online? Because that will raise
It will
awareness.
probably never go online because of the privacy laws of some of the countries involved. We have an agreement with the governing board that it will be accessible at our research center. You can take notes and take information as an Excel form from the database, but it cannot be freely accessible for privacy laws. These are the different regulations in different countries, and to do justice to all of them, rules out putting it online.
I mean, maybe one of the things, at least, we can help publicise through our newsletters that it exists, and when you have specific projects that individual researchers are working on, let us know, and we can broadcast that in the hope that people within our network can sort of tune in and help. Gwendolyn, you probably have a request.
Sure. I mean, it's a very different sort of issue that I'm dealing with, but I found that as someone whose research primarily was in the early modern period, stepping into this 19th century research offers a very different set of problems in terms of finding materials. And what I've discovered, at least through this project and also through several others, is that a lot of Ottoman print material ends up in private collections that researchers often do not know about unless by chance. And so it'd be wonderful that if you happen to see a Fulgenzi album or print come up for auction, or if you yourself happen to own any, I would love to hear about it. I scour as many auction catalogs as I can for each year, but inevitably there are always maybe one or two that we miss. And I think many of us can say that some of the best sources sometimes come to us through recommendations of concerned public or our friends and colleagues. And I was just speaking to one of you about looking through various different types of auction sites and platforms, and I think with so much information we have to be open to getting a reference from an outside source. And these are things that we cannot find in catalogs or through traditional research methods. And this is the case for a lot of new areas, or I should say burgeoning areas of research, particularly of things that are deemed ephemera.
If I may add to this, since luckily this book has been published in a series that I edit, which shares most of the goals that you just described. We try to publish autobiographical materials from the Near East, which has gone unnoticed, because it's texts that were written in hard-to-access languages, Croat, Bulgarian, Greek, Russian, etc., albeit holdings in private possession, or visual materials, also in collections that you first have to get access to and have get the rights to publish these. So we're very happy and very much depending on your input, also to draw our attention to such sources. We try to make them accessible to through this memorial series by providing an English translation and an introduction by academics to these texts. Sometimes also by a family member, a descendant of the author. And please think of us when you have a diary or a set of letters in your family that deals with the Eastern Mediterranean.
That's excellent. So thank you both very much. You've travelled some distance to come and talk to us. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.